Hi everyone, my name is Marina Cord. I will be going through my mini lessons for weeks 7 and 8 for the Integrated Teaching Unit for ARED 3309. My lessons will be addressing the 3rd grade curriculum, and my art piece that I'll be using is entitled I'll Fly Away by Michael A. Cummings. Michael A. Cummings is a prominently known quilter, which is what this art piece is. You can see the many fabrics that have been quilted together to create this art piece and tell this story. Michael Cummings' art is told through the style of African folk art, and it is representational throughout history. What this art piece is in particular, as you can see from the surroundings and the fabrics that make up the subject's clothing, the background is what looks like a field of crops. You can see that Michael A. Cummings is telling the story from the perspective of one who is living their life as a slave laborer. And I think you can also see that in the title of this art piece, I'll Fly Away. The subject is living a life that they wish to be free from. So that's what most of my lessons will be addressing is slavery in America. So we will start with my social studies lesson plan, which addresses the 3rd grade standard SS3H3, which is to explain the factors that shaped colonial America. Within that standard, it is to also describe colonial life in America from the perspectives of various people, such as large landowners, farmers, women, children, indentured servants, slaves, American Indians. So what my lesson will be focusing primarily on is indentured servants, slaves, and African Americans. So I have 2 objectives for this lesson. My first objective is that the student can recite and describe the typical role of an African American in colonial America. So to address this objective, it'll be primarily in the style of a class discussion. It's going to be when I introduce this art piece. And what we will start off with is talking about what the students see in this art piece, what they think is, what story they think is being told, and I think that this art work is a great tool to use to begin talking about life in colonial America for an African American. At the beginning of colonial America, the legalized practice of owning slaves the slaves were mostly people of African descent, and it was the backbone of all 13 colonies' economy. And about 20% of the 13 colonies' population was made up of people with African descent, and some of those people were free Americans, but most were not. And although most African Americans were enslaved in America, they still influenced the culture and history of America in a big way, and we can see that greatly in this art piece. I would talk with my students about how this quilt was crafted in the 20th century in 1991, but its historical depiction dates back to colonial America. So, that's a really important concept to understand when talking about the perspectives and the lives of people in colonial America, specifically African Americans in colonial America. So let's see. Most of this specific objective will be in the style of a class discussion. So my assessment to determine students who are achieving this objective is to go through, my class list and see what students are engaged, which students are bringing up their own ideas, which students are just contributing to this class discussion. My second objective is that students will identify and write about an important African American figure related to colonial American history. So this portion of my lesson will be done through a PowerPoint, and we'll start talking about, at this age, third graders are familiar with the American Revolution. They're familiar with 13 colonies. They're familiar with colonial America and people who they've learned about in the past, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Sons of Liberty. But this time was shaped and influenced by many people with many different stories of many different backgrounds and lives. And my lesson plan will begin to outline that. So what my PowerPoint will be addressing are well-known African Americans who helped shape colonial America. We'll go through their stories one by one, and when we finish, my students will get to choose a person that they learned about and get to write about their impressions of them, why they wanted to write about them, why they chose them, what they liked about their story, and in their own words, why this person was important to American history. So my assessment for that objective is that written report, what the student can write about when discussing that African American figure of their choosing. My next lesson will be for language arts. When introducing this art piece to my students, I would start off with a class discussion, just an initial class discussion by asking aesthetic questions about this art piece. I would ask them 3 aesthetic questions, one being just by your initial observation of this artwork, what emotions do they think that this artwork is trying to express, and what emotions does this artwork make them feel personally? My second aesthetic question would be based off of what they see in this artwork, what kind of culture that's being conveyed differs from or relates to their own understanding of their culture. What about this looks familiar to them, and what about this looks different? My third aesthetic question would be if this looks like artwork that they've normally seen, maybe if they've seen artwork that looks similar to this, and also what about this artwork makes them think of it as an art piece. So these questions mainly to just open up class discussion and also get the students to start really looking and observing the details of this art piece, because then I would lead my lesson into instructing my students to write down the story that they think this artwork is telling and how that story makes them feel without an initial overview of this artwork, without any background information. I would just like to see, just upon initial impressions, what the students think is really happening in this artwork. And then I would ask some of my students to share what they've written down, and then it would give us an opportunity to talk about the actual meaning of it together, whether the students knew exactly the story of this art piece or whether they needed a little bit more guidance. This would then help me introduce the book that we would be reading in our class, entitled Henry's Freedom Box, which tells the story of a little boy who was born into slavery. It follows this boy and his life into adulthood. We would read the story together as a class, and when we finished the book, I would have my students write a letter addressed to Henry. I would want them to touch on 3 main points in their letter. One being, how would the student feel if they were in Henry's shoes? 2, why do they think Henry risked so much for his freedom? And 3, what was their favorite part of Henry's story? So this letter and these key points that I've included for the students to address in their letter addresses this 3rd grade language arts standard to recount stories, including fables, folktales, and myths from diverse cultures. So I think that this Henry's Freedom Box is a great example of touching on this standard. This is a diverse culture for students who, they have no idea what life was like then, and will have no idea what that life was like, and it allows them to put themselves in the shoes of someone else that they are so different from. Recounting the stories would be addressed in the key point of writing about what their favorite part of the story, of Henry's story, was. The standard then goes on to say that the student should determine the central message, lesson, or moral, and explain how it is conveyed through the key details of the text. So the central message, the lesson, or the moral, I think, is brought up in the key point of why do they think Henry risked so much for his freedom? What was the overall message from this story, and how did they understand it? So my objectives for this lesson will be that students will respond verbally and write their feelings after viewing this specific artwork. So that is covered in the write-up of what they think is what their initial impressions of this art piece. My second objective will be that students will write a letter to the character in the book that we read. So my assessment for both of these objectives will be one, when we have this class discussion and when they write about, or when they share their stories that they've written about this art piece, I'll be checking off the students who are participating in the discussion, and I'll also be looking for specific adjectives that we've gone over in class and how they are applying them to observing an art piece. My second assessment for objective number 2 will be that in the letter I'll be looking for grammar criteria. Since this is language arts, I'll be looking for specific grammar key points that we've been discussing in language arts. So my next lesson will be in math, and we will not be discussing slavery in America concerning this art piece, but instead we'll be looking at the geometric shapes and the multiplication that exists in this very artwork. Together as a class, we will identify the different quadrilateral shapes and other geometric shapes that they see, and we'll discuss how the repeating shapes can be related to multiplication. I know that these shapes are not quadrilaterals. For example, using this, we will see that the quilt is a square, and on each side of the square there are there's the repeating use of triangles. So I would ask my students how many triangles are present on each side of the square. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 triangles on each side. And how many sides of this square, how many sides of the quilt are there? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 sides of a quilt and 6 triangles are on each side. How many triangles are there in total? And how could we write that as a multiplication problem? And what if there were 7 triangles on the quilt? What would that multiplication problem look like? So this lesson is addressing two math standards, one being the student can interpret products of whole numbers. For example, interpret 5 times 7 as the total number of objects in 5 groups, and in each group there are 7 objects in each. So again, using this as an example, what the multiplication problem would look like is 4 times 6. There are 4 sides, or groups, I guess you could say, and within each group there are 6 triangles. So 1 group, 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, 6 triangles in each. So my objectives to achieve these standards is that the student will recognize shapes. My second standard that will be addressed is that students understand that shapes are in different categories, and shapes in different categories like rhombuses, rectangles, and etc. Share attributes like having 4 sides, and they're known as quadrilaterals. They also should recognize rhombuses, rectangles, and squares as examples of the quadrilateral and draw examples of quadrilaterals that do not belong to any of these categories. So basically just going through geometric shapes will be in that standard, and my objectives to address those will be that students will recognize shapes in different categories and assess the meaning of multiplication by exemplifying the shapes through a multiplication problem. So what does 5 times 7 look like if you were to draw that out? 5 squares with 7 rhombuses in each square would be an example of a model of 5 times 7. So my assessment in achieving this objective will be to give my students a worksheet to complete with a number of multiplication problems, and I would require them to model these problems by grouping geometric shapes together accordingly. So my visual arts project will be, first the students will observe Michael Cummings's quilt, and they'll see and they'll take note of his use of geometric shapes and his use of lines and his use of repetition that helped create his story and his artwork. Students will then apply that concept to create their own story and their own artwork that also uses shapes, lines, and repetition. So students will cut out freeform objects, geometric shapes, whatever of their choosing, to create their story, and their story can be about anything. But it must have a subject, like Michael Cummings' quilt does. It has a subject, a central focus, in order for the story to be told. So this art project addresses the 3rd grade visual arts standard that the student selects and uses subject matter, symbols, and ideas to communicate a meaning. And the student can also observe how visual relationships of objects and ideas, such as proportion or placement, can affect appearance, and how arrangements may affect meaning or significance of the image. So the materials that the students will need for this project are pretty simple. What they'll need is a blank piece of canvas paper. It can be of any size they're choosing. They need multiple colors of construction paper to cut out their different shapes and their objects and whatever else they want to cut out. It needs to be multiple colors. And they'll also need scissors for this. They'll need a glue stick, and markers are optional, but they, are encouraged and can be used to add on to their artwork and their story that they are trying to convey. So the criteria for this art project is that the students can use any freeform shapes, but 3 of the following geometric shapes must be present at least once in the artwork. So we have a list: circle, rectangle, square, diamond, rhombus, triangle, oval, parallelogram, and trapezoid. So they have 9 geometric shapes to choose from, and they need to choose 3 of them to put into their artwork. And my assessment that will show their understanding of this project is that the student made an artwork entirely out of geometric and freeform shapes, and that the artwork had a subject and an overall focus, and that subject was able to tell a story to the observer. The second assessment will be that the student included line, shape, color, space, pattern, emphasis, variety, proportion, and unity within the artwork. So my last lesson will be for science, and what I saw in this artwork was that there were a lot of natural resources present in the quilt, and I thought that could be related to a science lesson. So if I were to introduce this art piece and relate it back to science and natural resources, I would ask, what kind of natural resources do the students see, and what do they see that exists within this art piece? What kind of vegetation do they see? Even what kind of animals do they see? As you can see that there are little fish. So when there are fish present, what needs to also be present is water. So like these little strips of blue definitely indicates that this is a body of water. And also I think you can tell what kind of climate this art piece depicts. the sky with the vegetation in the background, the crops, and the sky is kind of this, I don't know, to me it looks warm. But this will introduce my students learning about various habitats in various geographic locations. They'll learn what the vegetation looks like, what animals exist there, and what the climate looks like, and etc. So I'd start out then with another class discussion pertaining to here in Georgia, what kind of animals, plants, and climates they experience in their day-to-day life living in Georgia. And I'd also ask if any of my students have been to different parts of Georgia, such as Savannah or the Blue Ridge Mountains, and if they noticed any different climates, plants, landforms, animals, etc. in those different regions. So following that class discussion, I would introduce my PowerPoint lesson that outlines the different geographic regions of Georgia. My PowerPoint would outline what makes each region special and different, and what kind of animals and landforms and plants they can only see in that specific region. So this addresses the third grade science standard for students to obtain, evaluate, and communicate information about the similarities and differences between plants, animals, and habitats found within geographic regions of Georgia, such as the Blue Ridge Mountains, Piedmont, Coastal Plains, Valley and Ridge, and the Appalachian Plateau. My objectives for this lesson is that the student is able to identify the indicators of what makes geographic locations differ from each other through habitat, plants, and animals by them outlining Georgia's different geographic regions themselves. So my assessment of this is to give my students a worksheet. The worksheet will have pictures of different areas of Georgia, and underneath that picture we'll have animals and plants that are in that area, and the student must identify what geographic location of Georgia corresponds to that picture, corresponds to those animals, and corresponds to those plants. So those are all my lessons that I came up with for this wonderful artwork. I had actually a lot of fun, and I found it to be really interesting relating this artwork to different curriculums and different lesson plans. It was eye-opening and helpful and creative, and I really liked the challenge of it all. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks.